You're listening to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and today I want to address the question of what is trauma anyway? Or another way of saying this is, what makes a bad experience traumatizing? And then the second question I want to explore is, how do I know if I've experienced trauma? Because the fact of the matter is that many people with a history of trauma don't know they have a history of trauma. I had no idea of the trauma in my own story until my mid-30s, and I didn't really understand how much trauma I had experienced until my early 40s. So don't assume that if you have a history of trauma, you'll know it, because you won't necessarily. Before we dive in, I want to ask you to help support the podcast by downloading the Place We Find Ourselves app and paying $3 a month or $30 a year. By doing this, you not only support the podcast, but you'll get new episodes a month early. Instructions are on my website. Okay, let's begin. First, a disclaimer. The following episode is in no way a comprehensive answer to the question, what is trauma? There's no way that question can be adequately answered or addressed in a podcast episode, but I do want to highlight some of the key components of trauma, and my ultimate goal is to invite you to consider if you may have experienced more trauma than you realize. The word trauma comes from a Greek word meaning wound. Wound. A traumatic experience wounds the mind and it wounds the body. Literally, it changes the physical structure of the brain. We know this, just as a broken ankle changes the physical structure of the ankle joint. That's the first thing you need to hear. Trauma changes the physical structures of your mind and body. It wounds you. Now, what makes something traumatic? Two requirements must be met for something to be traumatic to the brain and body. And those two requirements are, one, a feeling of helplessness, combined with two, abandonment by potentially protective caregivers. The essence of trauma is helplessness combined with abandonment by those who could have helped but didn't. I would not want to minimize the damage done by the traumatic event itself. However, the event itself is not what determines if something is traumatizing. What really wounds the brain is the helpless terror of not being able to move your body or use your voice in such a way as to make the bad thing stop happening. And then the concomitant realization that you are utterly alone, that there is no one you can run to or talk to who will really be there for you and understand you and bring comfort and containment to your pain and help you process what happened. So, to say it another way, trauma introduces a pair of agonies into your heart. The agony of powerlessness, I can't say or do anything to make this awful thing stop happening, and the agony of betrayal. The people who are supposed to protect me and be there for me and help me aren't there. They may be physically there, but they aren't willing to care for me and engage with me and protect me and really help my devastated heart. So, please hear the implication. The event itself is not what makes something traumatic. Trauma does not reside in the event proper. It resides in how your brain and body subjectively experience the event. Your subjective experience, not the event itself, determines whether or not you will be traumatized by the experience. As a result, two people can experience the exact same awful event, and one may be traumatized by the event and the other might not be. So consider the following example, and just to prepare you, I'm about to share a short hypothetical story of the sexual abuse of two young girls. One day after school, two second-grade girls, Abigail and Bethany, are playing hide and seek with some older kids down the street. And during the game, one of the boys takes Abigail behind a woodpile and begins to fondle her. Abigail freezes. Later, The boy takes Bethany behind a woodpile and begins to fondle her, but instead of freezing, Bethany immediately runs away. Now, what has just happened? Both girls have been sexually abused by an older boy, but the story is not over. Abigail, the girl who froze, Abigail's body eventually unfreezes and she makes her way back to her house. She knows that telling her parents won't do any good. Dad won't believe her. Mom will tell her that she should have known better than to play with those boys. She somehow knows that her parents will not respond to her with comfort and care and help. On the other hand, the second girl, Bethany, runs home to her parents, tells them what happened, and is met by emotionally responsive and engaged parents who hold her, cry with her, help her process what has happened, and then take action to prevent it from happening again. Did Abigail and Bethany experience the same thing? Absolutely not. But the boy fondled both of them behind a woodpile. Yes, but it was an utterly traumatizing experience for Abigail, and it was considerably less damaging for Bethany. Were both sexually abused? Yes. Were both traumatized? What I would say is that Abigail experienced something traumatic and she was traumatized. Bethany experienced something traumatic, but she was not traumatized. In a brain scan, Abigail's brain will look very different than Bethany's. Why? Because the severity of trauma does not reside in the event proper, but in the subjective experience of helplessness and abandonment by those who are supposed to protect you and care for you. Bethany was able to do something with her body, run and cry, and with her words, talk to her parents. She had agency. She was able to move her body and use her voice in such a way as to make the bad thing stop. Hence, she did not experience nearly as much powerlessness as Abigail. Likewise, Bethany was not abandoned by her caregivers. She had two parents who were there for her, who attuned to her, who took her seriously. Hence, she was not betrayed by her parents. Abigail was. This story likely disturbs many of you, not only because it is a story of sexual abuse, but also because it raises the question, why did Abigail freeze, whereas Bethany ran away? I can't fully answer that question in this episode. However, if you are dying to know the answer, you can read about polyvagal theory. Polyvagal theory. I know it has a weird, scary scientific name, but it's incredibly practical and relevant for day-to-day life. And you can't understand why people respond to trauma, including you, the way that we do, unless you understand polyvagal theory. If you're interested in reading more, I recommend starting with a little book called The Pocket Guide to Polyvagal Theory by Stephen Porges. So back to the question, why did Abigail freeze whereas Bethany ran away? One possibility, and this is not the only possibility, but one possibility is that Abigail had a history of developmental trauma and Bethany did not. What is developmental trauma? In short, it's trauma that happens when you are very young and your brain is first developing. Developmental trauma refers to the experience of powerlessness and abandonment in your family of origin. In other words, powerlessness trying to get your needs met as a kid because your parents are not there for you. Developmental trauma is what happens in the brain and body of young children who do not have their big six needs met by their parents. What are the big six needs? If you want more on the big six developmental needs of every kid, you can listen to podcast episode 2. But in brief, here they are. Every child needs their parents to 1, be attuned to them. 2, be emotionally responsive to them. 3, engage their hearts. 4, be willing and able to regulate their affect. 5, be strong enough. The parents need to be strong enough to handle the child's negative emotions, anger, fear, sadness. And 6, The parents need to be willing to repair when they harm their child. So take those 6 core needs. If there is a poverty of those 6 things in the home of the child knows something of developmental trauma. To say it differently, when these 6 things are lacking, the brain does not develop properly, hence the term developmental trauma. Back to Abigail and Bethany. Why did Bethany run home and tell mom and dad, whereas Abigail did not? Well, if you grew up in a home where mom wasn't attuned to you, wasn't emotionally responsive to you, couldn't regulate your stress, how likely would you be to tell your parents if you got sexually abused as a 2nd grader? Let me put it this way. When a client shares a story of sexual abuse with me, I often ask, after it happened, who did you talk to first, your mom or your dad? It's a disarming question and usually a devastating one. Why? Because most people who have been abused didn't talk to either parent because they somehow knew in their gut that it wouldn't do any good. Now, you may be remembering a time when something bad happened to you and you didn't tell your parents. And you might be thinking to yourself, hey, wait a minute, Adam, I'm not sure that is my parents' fault. After all, I was the one who withdrew from them and kept them out. That was my choice not to tell them. Please, I beg you, the most basic human instinct is to run home and tell your parents when something bad has happened to you. What happens when a 6-year-old falls off their bike and cuts their knee open? The 6-year-old runs home and finds mom and dad. Evolution has hardwired into your brain the instinct to run home and tell your parents when something bad happens and get help and comfort and care. If you did not run home and tell your parents when something bad happened to you, there is a very good reason for that. When you were 2 years old and you got hurt, you did everything you could to let mom know that you were hurt and to get her attention and care. What happened between age 2 and the real bad thing that happened to you that you didn't tell your parents about? Why didn't you run to them and say help like you did when you were 2? Please let go of the illusion that you made the choice to shut your parents out and not tell them. A 15-year-old doesn't wake up one morning and choose to disregard millions of years of evolutionarily hardwired tendencies. No, you learned through countless experiences, no matter how subtle and short-lived those experiences may have been, you learned that telling mom would not result in the attention and care that you desperately needed. That going to dad was not going to help. Bessel van der Kolk is a trauma therapist who says that people who were downtown in New York City during 9/11, if they could run home to their loved ones and get in a safe place and share their experience with someone who cared about them, and if they could be held and comforted, those people recovered from the trauma of 9/11. Bessel's point is that as long as you can run home and be with your loved ones, you're okay. But then Bessel makes a very important point. He says this is why the trauma that happens at home is the worst kind of trauma. Do you see his point? Developmental trauma is trauma that happens at home. Developmental trauma is powerlessness and abandonment that happens at home with your parents, in your family. Now, I want to transition to the question of how do you know if you have experienced trauma? Let me say a simple 3-word sentence. Symptoms don't lie. Symptoms don't lie. If you have the symptoms of trauma, then it is very likely that you have experienced trauma, even if you look back on your story and you don't know exactly what part of your story was so traumatizing. What are the symptoms of trauma? There are a lot, but they can be grouped into 3 categories. Number 1, problems with affect regulation. Number 2, problems with interpersonal relationships. And number 3, problems receiving kindness, care, and comfort. In other words, it's difficult receiving kindness from others, and especially, it's difficult being kind toward your own heart and body. So think about your life. Do you have problems with affect regulation? In other words, do you get dysregulated often and have a hard time when you do get dysregulated bringing your body back to a state of calm and rest? If affect regulation is a new concept for you, please go back and listen to podcast episode 20, which explains what affect regulation is and why it's so important in day-to-day life. Trauma expert Pat Ogden puts it this way. She says the byproduct of trauma is an unregulated body experience, an uncontrollable cascade of strong emotions and physical sensations. Traumatized people frequently experience themselves as being at the mercy of their sensations as well as emotions, having lost the capacity to effectively regulate these functions. That's Pat Ogden. To put it more specifically, one symptom of trauma is frequent experiences of dysregulated hyperarousal, that is panic, terror, or rage, and or dysregulated hypoarousal, shame or hopeless despair. If your body gets thrown into states of physiological suffering, you feel the pain of dysregulation, and you don't know how to make it stop, then you may have a history of trauma. In fact, it is highly likely that you do, because that's one of the things trauma does to the brain and body. It sets you up for dysregulation, for what will feel like disproportionate emotion. In fact, if the language of affect regulation is not helpful to you, you may prefer to think in terms of disproportionate emotion. Disproportionate emotion. In other words, do you often find yourself experiencing what feels like disproportionate anger? Anger that feels bigger than the circumstance warrants? Or do you find yourself experiencing what feels like disproportionate fear and anxiety? When something bad happens, does your body get filled with fear or anxiety that just feels bigger than it should be, given the situation? Or shame. You do something wrong, and instead of feeling a slight sense of guilt about your behavior, you have a sense of shame, a sense of there is something wrong with me. Or last, sadness. Do you find yourself watching a movie or driving in your car, and you're suddenly overwhelmed by a wave of sadness that seems to come out of nowhere? The sensations in your body don't lie. They always tell the truth. If you find yourself feeling big feelings that seem to be bigger than the situation merits, there's a reason for that. Even if you don't know what that reason is, even if you can't link the sadness to anything that has happened in the past. Okay, that's symptom number 1. If you have problems with overwhelming emotion or affect dysregulation, you likely have a history of trauma. Number 2 symptom of trauma, problems with relationships. Now look, relationships are difficult. Everyone at some level has difficulty with relationships, but when you look back on your life, do you see the debris of lots of broken relationships? Or conversely, perhaps you have very few broken relationships when you look back, but you rarely, if ever, say anything that causes conflict in these relationships. The mark of a healthy relationship is the degree to which the two people can navigate conflict. In other words, how the relationship does after there is relational rupture. A fundamental symptom of trauma is that when you look back on your relationships, you see either a history of broken relationships, or you see a history of relationships that are intact, but they have never been ruptured because you don't feel the freedom to express your true thoughts and feelings. This symptom of relationship problems gets at the category of attachment. Developmental trauma results in insecure attachment. And insecure attachment makes interpersonal relationships very fraught. If the category of attachment is new to you, you may want to listen to podcast episodes 5 and 7, which are an introduction to attachment. Now, symptom of trauma number 1, dysregulation, leads to symptom number 2, difficulty with relationships. I mean, in some ways, these two are symbiotic and can't even be separated from each other. They're almost the same thing. How is that the case? Well, when you are dysregulated, it's hard to remain connected to another person relationally and at the same time be differentiated from them. Dysregulation makes us either super clingy because we need the other person to regulate us, or it makes us isolate from others so that we can self-regulate. In a healthy relationship, you are deeply connected to the other person while at the same time able to preserve and maintain your individuality, express your own thoughts and your own feelings. But when you are insecurely attached as a result of trauma in your story, it is very difficult to stay connected to and differentiated from another person, especially when there is conflict between the two of you. Are relationships hard for you? Are they exhausting? The symptoms don't lie. And symptom of trauma number 2 is problems with interpersonal relationships. Now, last symptom of trauma, problems receiving kindness. I'm going to devote the entire next episode to engaging this topic of kindness, but let me briefly say a few sentences here. People who have a history of trauma tend to have a rather large war inside with kindness. In other words, you will feel deeply ambivalent about kindness. Ambivalence means feeling two contradictory emotions at the same time. So, on the one hand, you will tend to long for kindness, care, and comfort from others. But at the same time, you will either be suspicious of this kindness, what's their agenda, or you will feel this nervousness and discomfort about it. Let me ask it this way. Is it hard for you to receive compliments? Is it hard for you to receive offers of kindness and care and comfort from others? Moreover, and this is the real kicker, people with a history of trauma tend to have a massive war with being kind to themselves. What does that mean? Well, when you are struggling, when you are not doing well, what posture do you have toward your heart and body? Do you have a posture that is kind and compassionate toward yourself? Or do you tend to push through or endure or push yourself harder or beat yourself up? Is it difficult for you to be kind toward your own body, kind toward your own heart, particularly when you are in emotional pain, when you're having a hard time, when you're not doing well? Again, this is a huge and massively important category for recovering from trauma, and we will explore it in more depth next week. Now, before ending, I want to address one more thing. Some of you may be opening to the possibility that you have experienced more trauma than you realized. And as you begin to do this, it is very common to get derailed by minimizing your story. Whenever someone begins to engage their trauma, I inevitably hear some version of the following. They'll say, I feel like what you are calling my trauma, Adam, is relatively small. I mean, I'm not starving in war-torn Syria. My father didn't beat me every night. Those are the kids who have trauma. There are people who have experienced more severe trauma than you. Does that mean that your trauma isn't worthy of engagement? There are people who had it worse than you. But does a broken arm hurt any less because it's not the worst pain you could be in. Is a broken arm worthy of tending to, even if something worse could have happened to you? If a 7-year-old broke her arm, would you say to her, "Come on, at least you're not a burn victim"? I mean, do you really want to go on minimizing your trauma? It may be that you in fact do, but it's not because your trauma didn't somehow damage your brain. It's because you don't want to look at just how much it messed you up. You don't want to admit that you couldn't overcome your frailty. What would it look like to be kind to your frailty as a child? Okay, that's a good setup for the next episode. Thank you so much for listening. Remember, consider supporting the podcast by downloading the app and paying $3 a month, $30 a year. By doing this, you not only support the podcast, but you'll get new episodes a month early. Instructions are on my website.